There are moments in a person's life that split time in two. Before and after, before the phone call, before the accident, before the diagnosis, before the words that cannot be unsaid. Most people spend their whole lives hoping those moments never come. Daniel Carrick had already lived through one of them when his wife Emma died of an aggressive cancer that took her in 6 horrible weeks. He had already crossed that line, already sorted everything he'd ever known into the pile labeled before and the pile labeled after. He thought the worst had happened. He thought the universe had already taken its shot. He was wrong. I want you to understand who Daniel was before any of this. Not the version of him that would emerge from the wreckage, but the man he was in the years when his life made sense, because the height from which someone falls is what determines the damage, and Daniel had built himself a good life, a careful life, the kind of life that looks solid from every angle. He grew up in Cannington, south of the river, the son of parents who both died before he turned 30. His father, a carpenter who built furniture in a workshop off the back porch, went from a heart attack at 61. His mother followed 2 years later, the doctors saying heart failure, but Daniel always believed it was grief. He was an only child. By 31 he had no family left at all, and he understood in his bones what it meant to be truly alone in the world. That particular silence that settles when there is no one left who knew you as a child, no one left who remembers your first bike or your bad haircuts or the year you tried to learn guitar and gave up after 3 weeks. Emma changed that. He met her at a structural engineering conference in the CBD. She was there as a compliance consultant. He was there as a project manager from a firm that handled commercial builds across Western Australia. She spilled coffee on his conference lanyard, laughed at herself with a complete lack of self-consciousness that he found immediately disarming, and spent the next 40 minutes explaining exactly why the morning's keynote speaker had gotten the load distribution calculations wrong. He was utterly gone before lunch. They dated for 2 years and married in a ceremony at a vineyard in the Swan Valley. 60 people, afternoon light filtering through the vines, Emma in a dress she'd found at a vintage shop in Subiaco that she'd paid a seamstress in Fremantle to alter. She wore her dark hair loose and carried flannel flowers because she'd always thought formal bouquets looked stiff. Danielle stood at the end of that aisle and thought, with the complete certainty of a man who understood structural integrity, this is the thing that holds everything up. They settled in Cottesloe, renting first and then buying a 2-bedroom apartment with a view of the Indian Ocean that they could just barely see from the 2nd bedroom if they stood on a chair. Emma's career in compliance took off. Daniel moved into senior project management. 17 years of climbing a ladder at an engineering firm on St. George Terrace, accumulating the kind of professional reputation that is built slowly and carefully through showing up and delivering and never letting anyone down. They didn't have children, which was a choice that had evolved from circumstance into intention. They talked about it, tried briefly, let the conversation settle into something else. They had their work and their friends and weekend breakfasts at a cafe on Cottesloe Beach, and the kind of comfort with each other that comes from genuinely liking the person you are married to. Emma's father died 4 years into their marriage, leaving her $340,000, a significant inheritance, a man's lifetime of work compressed into a number on a bank statement. They put it in a joint account and largely left it alone. Emma wanted it to sit and grow. "It's his life," she said once, looking at the account balance on her laptop. And Daniel understood she meant her father's life, the decades of saving and working and hoping it would matter to someone after he was gone. They invested conservatively. They did not touch it. Then Emma got sick. It came on fast, which is what made it so brutal. A cough she couldn't shake, a scan, then another scan, more detailed. Then a Thursday afternoon when a doctor sat them both down and used words like aggressive and advanced, and the particular clinical language that is designed to convey information while keeping the speaker at a safe distance from the weight of what they're saying. Emma was 41. She was the healthiest person Daniel knew. She ran 3 mornings a week along the esplanade. She ate well, she didn't smoke, she laughed easily. It didn't matter. The cancer didn't care about any of that. 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end, 6 weeks of hospitals and treatment and conversations, held in the small hours when the ward was quiet, of Daniel sleeping in a chair beside her bed because he could not make himself go home to an empty apartment, of watching the woman he loved diminish by increments so gradual and so devastating that some mornings he would arrive at the hospital and have to stop in the corridor and breathe before he could make himself go in. She knew she was dying by week 3. He knew it too, though they spent most of week 4 pretending otherwise. A tender mutual deception that they both understood was a gift to each other. She died on a Wednesday morning in May, when Perth was just beginning its slide toward autumn, and the air outside had that particular quality that comes with the first cool change after a long summer. He was holding her hand. He felt the moment of it, the precise instant when the warmth began to leave her fingers, and he sat with her for 45 minutes before he pressed the call button for the nurse. Those 6 weeks deserve more than the summary I have given them. They deserve more than anyone who was not there can actually give them. But let me try, because what happened in them matters to understanding what came after. The first week was still one in which a kind of hope was possible, the way hope persists in early illness, the way dawn persists even in winter, thin and cold, but present. They talked about treatment options with Emma's oncologist, a careful man who laid out pathways with the measured authority of someone trying to give accurate information without delivering it all at once. Emma listened, asked questions, took notes in the small notebook she kept in her handbag. She had always kept notes, couldn't trust memory alone, had been this way since university. Daniel sat beside her and held her hand when she didn't need the hand for writing, and tried to organize his terror into something that felt like usefulness. He cooked. This was what he knew how to do when he didn't know what else to do. He made food and brought it to the hospital, or heated it in the ward kitchen and brought it to her room. He found recipes on his phone late at night in the chair beside her bed, wanting to make things that were both nourishing and comforting, wanting the small triumph of a dish she actually felt like eating. By week 2, her appetite was unreliable. By week 3, it was nearly gone, and he would sit watching her try a few mouthfuls of something he'd made and feel the love and the grief happening simultaneously in the exact same moment, indistinguishable from each other. The nights in that chair, he had brought a pillow from home and a blanket she'd had since before they met, a good wool blanket, heavy and warm, the kind that is built to last. And he made himself as comfortable as the architecture of hospital seating allowed, and slept when he could, and woke when her monitors made noise, or when the nurses came in, or simply when the silence of the ward had a particular quality that woke him without cause. He learned to sleep in fragments, to surface and assess and descend again. He learned that there is a specific exhaustion that lives in the body when what you fear is close and cannot be prevented. She talked about her father in week 4, about memories she hadn't shared before, small specific ones. A Sunday morning when she was 9, and he'd taken her fishing and caught nothing but had been in such good humor that the failure became the story. A birthday when he'd made her a wooden box for her jewelry, badly made by a man who was not a craftsman, painted blue because she'd told him once she liked blue, and she'd kept it for decades because it was his care made physical. "He would have liked you," she said to Daniel. "He didn't have patience for show. He would have liked that you're real." By week 5 she had stopped pretending, and the pretending stopping was a mercy. It cleared the space for what the conversations needed to be. They talked about the apartment, about what he should do after. He didn't want to have the conversation, and she made him have it anyway, with the gentle insistence of someone who had always understood that the hard conversations were worth having. They talked about her father's money, about the friends he should call, about the plants on the balcony that he would probably forget to water, and she said this without accusation, just acknowledgement, and it made him cry in the particular way that small domestic truths do in catastrophic moments, because they contain the whole ordinary life within them. 127 people attended the funeral. Emma had been well loved. Her sister Rachel gave the eulogy, standing at the front of the chapel with tears that looked convincing, speaking about her sister with what seemed like genuine grief. Daniel stood in the front row and felt nothing except a vast, echoing emptiness that he suspected might be permanent. He spent the following months in a fog that was part grief and part habit. He went to work. He sat in meetings. He came home to the Cottesloe apartment, now stripped of Emma's presence, in ways that were both large and small. Her shoes gone from the hallway, her conditioner gone from the shower, the particular way she'd arranged the throw cushions on the couch, something he kept unconsciously trying to replicate and getting wrong. He ate poorly. He stopped running, stopped the weekend breakfasts, stopped most of the things that had given his days shape. He started drinking. Not dramatically at first. A glass of wine with dinner became two, became the bottle. Whiskey on weekends. He was managing it, he told himself. He was a man dealing with grief in ways that were probably statistically normal, he told himself. The bottle shop on Beaufort Street became a stop he made without quite deciding to, the way you start taking a shortcut that eventually becomes the only route you remember. What an evening looked like in those months. He would finish work, or the approximation of work that filled the hours of a man who was going through the motions of a professional identity he no longer inhabited, and drive to the Cottesloe apartment, where the ocean was a sound through the windows, and Emma's absence was a specific absence, shaped exactly like her. He would pour a glass without deciding to. Sometimes he would stand at the kitchen window and look at the lights on the water while the glass emptied, and then it would be refilled, and by that time he might have moved to the couch, and by that time he might have turned on the television, but only for the sound, not the meaning. The television sound helped and didn't help. It filled the room with voices, which was better than the silence. But it also reminded him of the evenings when Emma would come home and have opinions about whatever was on, when the sofa had been occupied by two people and the ordinary disagreement of remote control sovereignty and what constitutes an acceptable late evening snack. He would mute it eventually, or fall asleep without meaning to, waking at 1 or 2 in the morning with the particular stiff confusion of an accidental couch sleep, and lie there for a moment, looking at the ceiling of the Cottesloe apartment before the fact of where he was reassembled itself. The whiskey was for later, the wine was for the evening's first loneliness, and the whiskey was for the second kind, the 3 a.m. kind. When the ceiling of the apartment was too familiar and his thoughts had no place to go but circles. He knew this was not a sustainable arrangement. He was not, he told himself, an alcoholic. He held down his job. He appeared functional to colleagues. He showered and ate food and maintained the exterior of a person managing. What he did not say, could not yet say, was that the functioning exterior was becoming expensive to maintain, that the energy required to look like someone managing was energy that came from somewhere, and the somewhere was increasingly empty. He asked questions, too, about Emma's diagnosis and treatment. This is what grief does sometimes. It searches for something to hold accountable. He called her oncologist, emailed the hospital, requested copies of records. Not harassment, he thought, just trying to understand, trying to make the random brutality of it mean something. The doctors were patient with him, then less patient, then stopped responding. He kept emailing late at night in the grip of the whiskey and the silence. He did not know, in those months, that someone was watching all of this very carefully. He did not know that what looked to him like private grief was being catalogued by Rachel. He did not know that the fog he was living in was not just grief. It was also a trap, slowly assembling itself around him, waiting for the right moment. The right moment arrived at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, 14 months after he buried his wife. He was sitting in his car outside the bottle shop on Beaufort Street. The engine was running. The radio was on low, some late-night program, voices he wasn't listening to. The shop's fluorescent light through the window made everything inside look cold and institutional. He'd been sitting there for 6 minutes, which he didn't know because he'd stopped tracking time in any meaningful way. And he was having the argument with himself. He had most nights now, go in or go home. Go in, which meant tonight continued the pattern, or go home, which meant sitting in the apartment with the urn on the mantel and the absence that had no edges. His phone lit up the dark interior of the car. Unknown number. He looked at it for a moment. Something made him open it instead of swiping it away. Maybe the lateness. Maybe the whiskey already in his system making the normal filters sluggish. Maybe just the random mercy of a small decision going a particular way. He read it once, blinked, read it again. Your wife didn't die. She's alive and watching you. The cold started in his hands, not gradually. It was there instantly, his fingers going numb against the phone. A physical reaction that preceded any conscious thought by several seconds. His body understood something was wrong before his mind caught up. The phone slipped from his grip and clattered into the cup holder, and he sat there, staring at the steering wheel, while the fluorescent light from the bottle shop continued its cold, indifferent illumination of the night. 3 minutes. He sat without moving for 3 full minutes, which is longer than it sounds. Try it sometime. Sit perfectly still and watch a clock tick through 3 full minutes. That is the length of time Daniel Carrick spent suspended between one version of his life and whatever came next. What does a mind do with the impossible? It does not, as you might expect, reject it immediately. This is what he discovered in those 3 minutes in the car outside the Beaufort Street bottle shop. A mind confronted with the impossible does not dismiss it cleanly. It tries to find a pathway through the information. It offers possibilities, each one stranger than the last, each one failing in some particular way that the mind can then identify and discard before moving to the next. Perhaps it was the wrong number, a message intended for someone else. But no, the text addressed Emma directly. Addressed Daniel through Emma, said your wife. A message to the wrong number does not know your wife's name. Perhaps it was a cruel joke. Someone with access to his number, someone who knew his situation and had decided to wound him with this specific cruelty. This was possible. People did terrible things, but who would know? Who would do this, and to what end? Not robbery, not blackmail, just a statement and then silence. Perhaps. And here was where his mind went next and could not immediately retreat from. Perhaps it was true. He sat with that one longer than the others. Because the thing about this possibility was that it did not feel as purely insane as it should have. There was something in him, some part that had spent 14 months sleeping in chairs and signing death certificates and watching an urn on a mantel that wanted the impossible to be true so badly that it could not immediately marshal the evidence of his own experience against it. But the evidence was there. He had it. The 6 weeks of her illness, which he had been present for in a way that left no gaps, hospital records, oncology reports, conversations with doctors who had explained in clinical detail what was happening to Emma's body, the body he had sat beside, the breath he had heard slow and stop. He knew she was dead. He had witnessed it. And still, and this was the cruelty of the message, the reason it worked, still the impossible hope had found a purchase in him. Because grief is not rational. because the part of a person that loves does not obey the same rules as the part that reasons. And the part of him that had loved Emma for 15 years would not fully accept her absence, no matter what the rational part knew to be true. His hands had gone cold on the steering wheel. The bottle shop's fluorescent light continued its indifferent illumination of the night, the shelves visible through the window in their bright, organized rows. A car pulled into the car park beside him, and a young couple got out, laughing at something, and walked past without looking at him. A man frozen in his car in the dark, halfway between his past and what the past had just become. He picked up his phone again, looked at the message. 5 words. He expanded the number, got only the unknown number header that phone screens show when there is nothing to show. He tried calling it. It rang 6 times and went to a generic voicemail message. He hung up. Emma's coffin. He saw it clearly. The pale wood they had chosen, and he had hated himself for having to choose it, had stood in the funeral home in Netherlands with a catalogue and a grief counsellor who kept saying things like, "There's no wrong answer," in a voice that meant the opposite. The flowers, white flannel flowers, because Emma had loved them, and he had thought of her wedding bouquet. The 127 people in that chapel. The eulogy Rachel had given, the tears, the hand on his arm afterward, the death certificate. He'd signed it. He'd held the pen in his hand in that hospital corridor and signed his name beneath the words and the date, and the pen had felt impossibly heavy, like a thing he would never put down. The urn, sitting on his mantel, 14 months of it sitting there, him walking past it every morning on the way to the kitchen, saying nothing and meaning everything. He picked up the phone with fingers that weren't quite steady and typed, "Who is this?" He watched the screen. Nothing. He typed it again, adding, "Please, who is this?" Nothing. He sat in that car for another 20 minutes, the engine still running, the bottle shop still glowing, and gradually the numbness in his hands spread inward and became something else. Not grief, not the fog, something sharper and more terrible, the thing that lives in the space between a lie and a truth when you cannot tell the difference. You need to understand what that text was designed to do, whether its sender understood this consciously or not. It was designed to make a grieving man doubt his own reality, to make him question the most devastating thing he had ever witnessed, to plant a seed that would grow in the dark until it consumed everything else, and to do this while offering no explanation, no evidence, no follow-up. Just 5 words and a period, and then silence. It was an act of extraordinary cruelty, and it worked. He went home without going into the bottle shop. He stood in front of Emma's urn for a long time. He went to bed and did not sleep. By 3 a.m. he was sending emails to the hospital, to her oncologist, to Emma's former colleagues, to anyone he could think of who might know something, might have seen something, might be able to tell him that a woman who had died in front of him was not somehow impossibly alive. By morning he had 23 unanswered emails and a certainty that he needed to talk to someone who had known Emma, someone who might know the truth. The morning had the quality of all mornings after sleepless nights, slightly unreal. The edges of things blurred, the ordinary mechanics of getting up and moving through space, carrying an additional weight that had no physical source. He showered. He made coffee and stood at the kitchen window looking at the Indian Ocean, that just barely visible edge of it from the second bedroom, if you stood on a chair, but from the kitchen window only if the light was right and the sky was clear enough. And this morning it was too overcast and the horizon was grey. He drank the coffee standing up. He could not have explained why he didn't sit down. It had something to do with the sense that sitting down would commit him to the specific reality of the kitchen, of the apartment, of everything the apartment contained and didn't contain, and he wasn't ready for that yet. He thought about calling Emma's oncologist again. He had the number saved. Still saved, 14 months later. The way you keep certain things, because deleting them feels like a finality you haven't authorized. But what would he say? He had already called, already emailed, already been treated with the patience and then the impatience of people who had information they'd given and couldn't give differently. The death certificate existed. The process had been followed. The medical records were available to him, and he had them in a folder in the filing cabinet in the second bedroom that was now a storage room, because he had requested them and studied them and understood them with his engineering mind. The precision of someone who is trained to look for the structural failure, and the records had shown him exactly what had happened, and it had made no difference at all to the grief. He called Rachel because she was what remained, because she was the last person who had been close to Emma, the last connection to the family that Emma had been, and because the text had said watching you, and that meant someone was present, and present meant alive, and Rachel was alive. And Rachel would know. He called Rachel. Here's the thing about Rachel that Daniel didn't fully understand until much later, until all of it was over and he could look back with clear eyes at the architecture of what had happened. Rachel had never liked him. She'd been pleasant at family dinners and Christmas gatherings and all the occasions where liking was required by proximity, but the warmth had always been performed rather than felt. He'd sensed it sometimes, the way you sense a cold draft from a window you haven't located yet, something off in the air, something not quite right. He'd attributed it to personality differences, to the slightly formal relationship that sometimes develops between siblings when one of them marries, and the dynamic shifts. He'd never thought to look deeper. He called her at 7:30 in the morning, which should tell you how far from his normal judgment he had traveled overnight. She picked up on the third ring. "Daniel, it's early." "I got a text," he said, and told her what it said. The silence on the other end of the line lasted 4 or 5 seconds. It felt longer. "Can you send me a screenshot?" she said finally. "Of course." "Rachel, what do you think it means? Could someone be playing a—" "Send me the screenshot. Come over this afternoon, we'll talk." He sent the screenshot and drove to her house in Dalkeith, the nice house, the one with the rose garden out front that Emma had always admired. Rachel met him at the door with the expression of a woman who had been crying but had recently decided to stop. She led him to the kitchen. Her husband Marcus was there, which Daniel hadn't expected, and a third person he didn't recognize, a man in his 50s with the particular posture of someone accustomed to sitting in rooms with bad news. "Who is this?" Daniel asked. "His name is Gordon," Rachel said. "He's a lawyer. Please sit down." What happened in the next 2 hours was not a conversation, it was a presentation. Gordon had documents, printed documents, organized into a folder, tabbed and flagged. He placed it on the kitchen table and opened it to the first page with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this before many times, in many kitchens, with many people whose lives were about to change. The emails first. Printouts of messages sent from Daniel's account, some of them to Emma's medical team, some of them to people he'd worked with, some of them to Rachel herself. They were sent between 1:00 a.m. and 4:00 a.m. over the previous 14 months. They were rambling and sometimes incoherent, the kind of writing that happens when a man who has had too much to drink is trying to process something enormous and alone at 3 a.m. He read through them with growing dread, recognizing phrases, recognizing the emotional state behind each one, seeing how they looked collected together on paper in a lawyer's folder, rather than scattered across months of private grief. He had not remembered sending many of them. This was the whiskey's fault, the late nights, the particular amnesia that comes with certain kinds of grief drinking. But he had sent them, he could not claim otherwise. He looked at the printed emails for a long time, not at the words exactly, but at the fact of them. his own handwriting in the address fields, his own phrasing, the particular patterns of speech that you don't hear in yourself because they are simply the water you swim in, but that become visible when placed on printed paper in a lawyer's folder in a kitchen you never expected to be sitting in. He recognized them the way you recognize a photograph of yourself caught unawares. It is undeniably you, and yet the you in the photograph has no knowledge of the lens, is operating in the privacy that doesn't know it's being watched, and that makes it more true and more exposing than any deliberate image. The 3 a.m. emails. He had a memory, imprecise and disorganized, of certain nights in the months after Emma died, of sitting at the kitchen table with the laptop open, the whiskey beside it, the city outside gone quiet. He'd thought of those sessions as processing, as doing the work of grief by articulating it, by sending into the world what was too large to keep inside. He had not thought about who received those words, had not thought about how they would read to someone looking at them with fresh eyes in morning light. He thought about it now. He read through several of them with the cold objectivity of someone reading a stranger's communications, trying to see what Rachel and Gordon and the employer who'd received copies had seen. The incoherence of late-night grief, the oscillation between anger and tenderness, the questions that had no addressee, the accusations that weren't quite accusations because they had no clear target. He could see how they built a picture. He could see exactly how they'd been used. The thing he would understand more clearly later, they had told the truth of a man in pain. They just weren't the whole truth. They were the truth of his worst hours, extracted from context, arranged into evidence of something they were not quite. Then the photographs, the apartment, captured at moments when it was at its worst, dishes in the sink, bottles on the counter, clothes on the floor, the general entropy of a man living alone and not managing well. He stared at these for a long time. "When were these taken?" he said. "How did someone get inside my apartment?" "We have significant concerns about your well-being," Gordon said, in the neutral tone of someone reading from a prepared statement. Then the letter from his employer. Not a termination. Not yet, but a formal documentation of concerns, missed deadlines, a meeting where he'd been unfocused, a presentation he'd delivered poorly, performance issues, and erratic behavior, the phrases sitting in official font on company letterhead, looking nothing like the man he thought he was, and everything like the man the folder was building him into. Daniel looked at Rachel across the table. She was looking at her hands. "You're saying I'm unstable," he said. "We're saying we're concerned," Gordon said. "You had someone in my apartment." Nobody answered that. "Rachel." He waited until she looked up. "Did you send that text?" The question hung in the air. Marcus shifted in his chair. Gordon gathered his papers. Rachel held Daniel's gaze for a moment, and then looked away, which was not a denial. It was not a confession either. It was the look of someone who has made a decision and does not intend to revisit it. He drove home through the morning traffic, past the river, past the city, past all the normal Perth life going on around him, school drop-offs and coffee shops opening and tradies in their utes, and felt the whole architecture of his existence beginning to list. He did not know yet how bad it was going to get. He did not know that what had felt like an ambush in that kitchen was actually the first move in something that had been planned for much longer than an overnight. In the days that followed, the unraveling came not slowly, but all at once, the way the premise of a structure fails, not beam by beam, but as a system catastrophically once the critical point is crossed. He lost his job on a Thursday, 7 days after Rachel's kitchen. His manager called him into the office, the kind of call you know before it happens, and walked him through the documentation with the expression of a man who has been coached on what to say. 17 years of service, a genuinely impressive project record, commendations from clients on 3 separate Heritage Trust projects. None of it mattered now. The folder had reached his employer before his manager even called him in. 3 months severance if he didn't contest it. A number that sounded like money until he did the math and calculated how long it would last if he couldn't find another senior role quickly. Which he wouldn't, because in the tight professional circles of Perth's engineering world, a man who's been let go for erratic behavior has a particular half-life. Rachel filed for conservatorship of Emma's estate the following Tuesday, 2 weeks after the kitchen. The filing cited Daniel's financial incompetence and his status as a danger to Emma's legacy. The estate, Emma's father's $340,000, now sitting in the account they'd barely touched, was suddenly frozen while the court process moved forward. Daniel's name was on the account, but conservatorship proceedings put everything in suspension, and he couldn't access what should rightfully be his without triggering legal complications he couldn't afford a lawyer to sort out. He hired a lawyer anyway. She cost him $4.200 in the first 2 weeks, and then told him that contesting the conservatorship quickly was unlikely, and that he should focus on demonstrating stability. Stability. The word felt like a particular kind of joke. Within 3 weeks, the silence from friends was almost complete. Not loudly. Perth doesn't work like that. It's a big city, but it has a small-town quality in its professional circles. The kind of place where everyone knows someone who knows someone, and where reputation is currency that can be spent or stolen. Rachel had been making calls, expressing concern, the careful, devastating kind of concern that sounds like caring and functions like demolition. "I'm worried about Daniel, between you and me. The grief has really affected him, and I think people should be careful." The specific words weren't available to him, but their effect was calls unreturned, invitations stopped, the subtle social withdrawal of people who have decided, perhaps kindly, perhaps for their own protection, perhaps simply because Rachel had been persuasive, that Daniel Carrick was someone to avoid right now. By week 4, he was in a studio apartment in Northbridge. The Cottesloe apartment was gone. He'd had to break the lease. Couldn't cover the rent without his salary, and the severance money was already being consumed by the lawyer and the basic costs of existing. The studio had rust stains in the shower, and the previous tenant had left a hot plate that worked only on the lower setting. The carpet was a shade of brown that had been installed in, he estimated, 1987, and the window faced the wall of the building next door. He sold the bed frame for $85 because he needed the space more than the furniture, and he slept on a mattress on the floor and stared at the ceiling of that studio apartment and tried to understand what had happened to him. The urn was on the windowsill. He'd brought it from the apartment, wrapped in a sweater in a box with other things he'd salvaged from storage. Emma's urn and his father's old planes, woodworking planes. His father had kept them oiled and sharp, and Daniel had taken them after the funeral without knowing why. Those 2 things he would not sell, would not store, would not part with. You know what the strangest part of losing everything is? It doesn't announce itself dramatically. There are no orchestral swells, no clear narrative moments where you stand on a precipice and understand the totality of what's happened. It comes incrementally, each small loss arriving on the heels of the previous one, until one morning you are lying on a mattress on the floor of a Northbridge studio trying to remember who you are. Not a husband. Emma was gone. He had watched her die. Whatever that text had intended to do, it could not undo what he'd witnessed, could not make the 6 weeks of her illness and the Wednesday morning in May into something other than what they were. Not a project manager. Gone. Not a friend. The silence of his phone in those weeks was a particular kind of noise, the noise of negative space. Not a son or brother. His parents were long gone. Emma had been his family, the whole of it. And now Emma was gone, and Rachel had taken what remained of Emma's presence, her money, her memory, the narrative of who she'd been, and turned it into ammunition. He was 43 years old, riding the public bus because his car had been repossessed after 2 missed payments, watching Perth roll past the windows like a city he'd visited once and couldn't quite remember, and he did not know who he was or what remained of him to build from. The bus routes became familiar in a way that driving never makes a city familiar, because driving keeps you inside a vehicle that keeps you inside your own momentum. And riding a bus puts you in contact with the specific geography of a place at human pace. He learned the rhythm of the inner Perth routes, which stops were busy in the morning rush, which streets the drivers took as shortcuts when the main roads were backed up, which junctions had the longest waits, and which passengers were regulars he could identify by the way they settled into seats with the comfort of people doing the same thing they always did. He watched them, not intrusively, just the particular attention of a man with nothing specific to look at who has discovered that other people's existence is interesting when yours has temporarily contracted. An elderly man who rode the 60 bus every Tuesday with a shopping bag and fell asleep before Beaufort Street every time. A group of teenagers who boarded together at the North Bridge stop on Thursday afternoons, filling the back seats with the specific energy of young people in transit between school and the rest of their lives, their volume modulated by whether they thought adults were paying attention, a woman about his age, a briefcase on her lap, who read through documents with the focused intensity of someone whose mind was doing real work, and whose face sometimes shifted slightly with an expression he recognized, the expression of someone who has just solved something. He looked at the houses from those windows more carefully than he'd ever looked at houses from a car. This was the thing he kept returning to in those bus rides, the way Perth's inner suburbs laid their entire history out along the routes, the housing stock moving through decades as you travelled, the 1890s workers' cottages of East Perth giving way to the interwar Federation houses of Mount Lawley, the post-war brick bungalows of Maylands, the occasional 1970s flat-roofed aberration that had never quite made peace with the climate, the 1990s developments that had replaced half-demolished originals and left gaps in the streetscape like missing teeth. He looked at them with the same eyes his father had used on old furniture, seeing what they had been and what had been done to them since, and what remained of the original intention. The Jarrah veranda boards replaced with Merbar, because it was cheaper and available. The original hung sash windows blocked in with aluminum sliding panes that didn't breathe in summer and rattled in winter. The pressed metal ceilings he could imagine behind the plasterboard that had been installed over them in some 1970s renovation impulse that had not aged well. He could see, with the clarity of a man who has nothing else to focus his mind on, exactly what had been lost in each case and exactly what would be needed to address it. He did not know yet that this was the beginning of something. It felt like nothing more than what it was. A man on a bus, looking at old houses through a dirty window, unemployed and increasingly broke, with no clear picture of what came next. But the looking was real, and the knowledge behind it was real, and those two things together were building toward a Wednesday morning, and a phone call and a notice on a cork board. Even though he couldn't see any of that from his window seat on the 60 bus to Morley, I need you to sit with that for a moment, because what comes next only means what it needs to mean if you understand the depth of that flaw. The bus he rode most often went from North Bridge up through Mount Lawley and on toward Morley. He rode it sometimes with no destination, just to be in motion, which is a thing people do when the alternative is sitting still in a studio apartment, waiting for a life to return that is not going to return. He watched the streets through dirty bus windows, the heritage cottages of Mount Lawley, the Federation houses of Maylands, the post-war workers' cottages that lined street after street of inner Perth. He'd grown up around these houses. His father had worked on them. As a young man, before corporate project management had claimed him for its spreadsheets and stakeholder meetings, he'd worked on heritage sites around Fremantle. Real work, physical work, his hands understanding old construction in a way that his mind had since overwritten with procurement processes and timeline management. He noticed the houses now in a way he hadn't for years. Their bones, their problems, the bad repair work visible from the bus window, the replacement windows that didn't match the original proportions, the brick pointed with the wrong mortar, the verandas that had been enclosed with materials that didn't understand the climate. He'd look at them, and his hands would know, specifically and precisely, what needed to be done. It was like a language he'd stopped speaking and never lost. He was in his studio one evening, 11 weeks after the text, 3 months after losing his job, sitting in the specific way of a man who has run out of things to do and is not ready to admit what he's about to do instead, when his phone rang. He almost didn't answer it. Habit had made him suspicious of calls. Too many lawyers, too many creditors, too many conversations that cost him things he didn't have. But the number had a local prefix, and something made him pick up. "Mr. Carrick, this is Donna from the property management. We used to manage your Cottesloe apartment. The new tenants are doing a deep clean, and they found some things in the ceiling cavity. Architectural drawings by the looks. They were about to throw them out, but I wanted to check with you first." He blinked. He'd forgotten about those entirely. Drawings from early in his career. Detailed plans he'd done for heritage renovations around Fremantle, kept for sentimental reasons, shoved into the ceiling cavity when storage space got too tight. He'd done that, 12 years ago? 15. "I'll come get them," he said. He took the bus. The new tenants were a young couple who handed over the rolled drawings with the mildly befuddled generosity of people who'd found a stranger's belongings and felt responsible for them. He tucked them under his arm and took the bus home. That night he unrolled them on the floor of his studio. Not enough table space, so the floor, which meant kneeling over them with a flashlight because the overhead light was poor. They spread across the carpet like topographic maps of a country he'd lived in once. Cross-sections of original construction, load-bearing details rendered in precise pencil, elevation drawings of facades he remembered, could picture still, could feel the textures of if he closed his eyes. They were good. He looked at them for a long time, kneeling on the 1987 carpet of a Northbridge studio, and thought, these are genuinely good. He'd been a skilled draftsman before computers had made the skill obsolete in his industry. He'd understood old buildings the way his father had understood old wood, not just structurally, but as living things with histories and intentions, built for specific climates and specific lives by people who'd thought carefully about what they were making. He rolled them back up and went to sleep. The next morning, he walked to the cafe around the corner from the studio because he couldn't afford it, and he needed it anyway. While he waited for his flat white, he noticed the community board beside the counter, the physical kind, corkboard with actual paper notices pinned to it, the kind that still exists in inner-city Perth, despite everything. He didn't know why he looked at it. He generally didn't. One notice had been there long enough that the paper was slightly curled at the corners. Handwritten, which was unusual, seeking tradesperson experienced in original construction techniques, 1920s cottage in Mount Lawley. Heritage restoration, not renovation. Budget, 15 $. All licensed contractors quoted over $35, $. A name and a phone number at the bottom. He read it twice. The specificity of original construction techniques was interesting. Not just old house restoration, which any contractor could claim. Original techniques, someone who knew the difference. He had his drawings under his arm, which he'd brought for no particular reason. The habit of a man who carries his important things because he doesn't have enough space anywhere to leave them safely. He took out a pen and wrote his name and the studio's number on the torn edge of another notice. He walked out thinking he probably wouldn't call, that she probably wouldn't call, that this was a gesture towards something rather than a real action. That afternoon, his phone rang. Her name was Judith, retired high school art teacher, 67, with the voice of someone who has spent decades teaching rooms full of teenagers and has made peace with the fact that directness saves time. She'd inherited the Mount Lawley cottage from her aunt, who'd lived in it from 1958 until her death the previous year. Every contractor Judith had brought through wanted to renovate. They see original Jarrah floorboards and they want to know if I'd consider replacing them. As if I would. She said the last 4 words with the contained outrage of someone who has been asked this question too many times. "Can you come look at it?" she said. He took the bus to Mount Lawley the next morning. The cottage was on a quiet street where the old Moreton Bay fig trees arched over the road like a procession, their roots lifting the footpath in slow motion. The house itself was small, white-painted brick, a return veranda in pressed metal, Jarrah window frames slightly swollen with the humidity of a Perth summer, but intact. He stood on the footpath for a minute before he went in, just looking at it. Inside, his hands started knowing things before he consciously processed them. The floor settled under him in the particular way of Jarrah over old stumps. A movement you either understand or you don't, and understanding it means knowing how to address it without replacing anything. The lime plaster walls. The pressed metal ceilings. A ceiling rose in the front room that had been painted over so many times it had lost most of its detail. But the original form was still there beneath the layers, if you knew how to look. He moved through the rooms slowly, running his fingers along wall junctions, looking at ceiling corners, crouching to examine the underfloor access hatch in the hallway. Judith followed him without speaking, which was the right call. She understood that she was watching someone read something. When he stood up and turned to face her, he said, "I can do this for 14 dendans, $200. Materials plus my labor. 4 weeks." She studied him, not quickly. Judith was a woman who looked at things the way teachers look at students' work, not for the answer, but for the thinking behind the answer. "You're not licensed anymore," she said. "No." "Why not?" "I haven't been working in trades. I was a project manager. And now I'm not." She looked at him for another few seconds and said, "Good. Licensed contractors want to charge me for their insurance and their fancy utes and the privilege of not knowing what they're doing. I want someone who gives a damn about the house. When can you start?" He started Monday. The first morning he was on site before 6. He had borrowed tools from a neighbor in the studio building, an older man named Terry, who'd done kitchen fitting for 30 years and had a shed full of equipment he no longer used, and supplemented these with purchases from the salvage yard in Bayswater. Not good tools, not yet, but adequate. He worked alone, which suited him. The cottage in the early morning had the quality that old houses have when they're empty and the light is low, a presence, a sense of something that had witnessed decades of ordinary life and was waiting to continue. The first week was mostly assessment and preparation, careful work, the kind of work where you spend more time looking and measuring than actually doing anything visible, because the doing must be exactly right once it begins. He ate sandwiches he'd made at the studio and drank water from a bottle and worked until the light went. He slept better than he had in months, genuinely slept, not the grey semi-consciousness of the previous weeks. The physical work was part of it, his body tired and satisfied, not the depleted, restless tiredness of insomnia. But it was also the thinking the work required. He had no bandwidth for circling at 3 a.m. because during the day his mind had been fully occupied, held by the specific demands of old construction, the way a hard puzzle holds your attention while you're solving it. There was something else that the work did, which he couldn't have articulated in the first days, but came clearer as the weeks moved forward. It put him in his body in a way he hadn't been for years, perhaps for the entire tenure of his corporate career, which had been conducted largely from the neck up in chairs, with screens and spreadsheets and the particular disembodied quality of professional life that is all thought and communication and almost no physical doing. His hands hurt in the first week. Good pain. The pain of muscles recalibrating, of old capability reactivating. He had calluses by the end of the second week in the places that the tools pressed. His shoulders ached from overhead work, from the time spent on the ceiling rows, from the sustained posture of someone doing careful work in awkward positions. He bought a tube of hand cream from the chemist on the walk home one evening, something he hadn't owned since before Emma died. She'd been the one who thought about things like hand cream and rubbed it in, sitting on the edge of the mattress in the studio, looking at his palms with something approaching satisfaction. His father's hands had looked like this. He remembered them without quite knowing he was remembering. The particular worn, smooth texture of old calluses, the specific strength in the grip, the way his father could pick up a piece of timber and tell you things about it before he'd done anything else. "Listen to the wood," his father had said once, and Daniel had been 14 and had found this slightly mystical, had not known that 30 years later he would be sitting on a mattress on the floor of a Northbridge studio, beginning to feel what his father had meant. He did not drink during the Judith project, or rather, he had a beer one evening in the first week alone in the studio, and it didn't taste right. Not because he'd become abstinent, but because the specific comfort the alcohol had offered in the Cottesloe apartment was a comfort against a specific emptiness, and the emptiness was beginning to look different. He put the beer down, half finished. He made tea. He looked at the week's drawings spread on the floor and thought about what needed doing in the morning, and the thinking felt clean. By day 9, something happened that he hadn't expected. He had been working on the ceiling rows in the front room. 3 contractors had told Judith it was beyond restoration. Too many paint layers, the detail too compromised. Replacement was the only option. He'd spent the first 3 days of that week studying it, doing test patches in inconspicuous areas, understanding exactly what was beneath the accumulated layers. Then he'd begun, slowly, with the patience that this work either develops in you or reveals was never there to begin with. Hour by hour, the original form re-emerging, the acanthus leaves, the center boss, the fine detail that some craftsman in 1923 had pressed into wet plaster with his own hands, intending it to last. 11 hours of work over 2 days. He stepped back. It looked like it had in 1923. He stood in that room in the late afternoon light and felt something move through him that he had not felt in a very long time. Not happiness exactly. Something deeper and quieter. The satisfaction of having done a thing well, of having made something real. He hadn't realized until that moment how completely that feeling had been absent from his life for years, not just the past 14 months, but for longer than that. For most of the time he'd spent in conference rooms and on video calls, and managing people, managing other people toward outcomes that would be replaced by new outcomes in the next quarterly cycle. He had built something real. He had restored something that 3 other people had written off, and it was good. That evening, Judith came by to check progress. He showed her the ceiling rows without preamble. She walked into the room, looked up and stopped. The silence lasted long enough that he started to wonder if he'd miscalculated something. Then she said, very quietly, "My aunt used to talk about that rose. She said it was her favorite thing in the house." 2 days later, Judith brought her friend Margaret. Margaret owned a Federation house in Subiaco, 1910, one of the good ones. 2-story bullnose veranda, decorative gable work in need of significant attention. She walked through her house with Daniel that afternoon, watching his hands and his eyes, and listening to him explain what he saw. She hired him before she'd driven home, Margaret told Patricia. Patricia ran the Mount Lawley Heritage Society, not in any official capacity, but in the way that one person in any small organization is the connective tissue, the one everyone calls when they need something. The Heritage Society newsletter, a modest thing distributed to a few hundred subscribers in the inner northern suburbs, published a two-line note. A craftsman who actually understands old houses called Judith for a referral. Daniel's phone started ringing. Not all at once, not the sudden flood of a viral moment, but steadily, persistently, the way water finds its way through old mortar, because it follows the path of actual value, and you cannot prevent it if the value is genuinely there. People who owned old houses and wanted them properly cared for, people who'd been quoted impossibly high by licensed contractors and were looking for someone who would respect what they had. People who'd heard from someone who'd heard from someone else about a former engineer who'd found his way back to something older and truer. He was not operating legally, technically. He held no current trades license. He was transparent about this with every client. He told them up front, explained exactly what it meant, and let them decide. Every single one of them decided to hire him anyway, because what he offered was not a license. It was knowledge and care and the willingness to spend 11 hours restoring a ceiling rose that anyone else would have ripped down. He was 3 months out from the night on Beaufort Street when he realized he had more work than he could do alone. He hired 2 apprentices. He found them in an unlikely place, an online forum for heritage building enthusiasts, the kind of niche community that attracts people who are genuinely passionate rather than commercially motivated. Owen was 23, a school dropout who'd been renovating houses with his father for years and wanted to learn more than his father could teach him. Ria was 26, had a degree in architectural history and 0 practical skills, but an ability to research historical building techniques that Daniel found immediately useful. Neither of them was licensed either, which made them perfect in a way that the conventional job market would never have recognized. He taught them what he knew, the way his father had taught him, years before either of them understood what was being transmitted, not just techniques, but a relationship with material, a respect for what old things contain of the lives lived around them. Owen took to the physical work with the ease of someone who has been waiting to be taught properly. Ria could read a historical photograph and identify construction methods with an accuracy that sometimes made Daniel stop and look at her. There was a specific afternoon in the 2nd month of their working together. They were on a house in Bassendean, a Federation cottage that had been partially renovated in the 1990s and needed the renovation undone as much as anything, when Owen made a judgment call that surprised Daniel. They had been working on a doorway where the original architrave had been removed and replaced with a flat timber surround. The kind of cheap, efficient substitution that had been done all over Perth's inner suburb housing stock in the decades when old meant outdated rather than valuable. Daniel had shown Owen the original construction marks on the wall, the ghost impression where the original profile had pressed against the plaster for 60 years, and had described what the replacement should be. He'd then gone to the back of the house to assess the bathroom, leaving Owen to begin the work. When he returned, Owen had done something he hadn't been told to do. He'd sourced from the timber pile a piece of old-growth jarrah, salvaged from another demolished element of the same house, rather than using the new timber they had stocked. He was working it down at the bench, shaping the profile from the solid piece with hand tools, replicating the original rather than purchasing a manufactured molding. It would take 4 times as long. The result would be, to the undiscerning eye, indistinguishable from a manufactured alternative. To the wall and to the house, it would be exactly right. Daniel looked at what Owen was doing and said nothing for a moment. Then, "Where did you get that?" Owen explained. His voice had the slight defensive quality of someone who expects to be corrected. "That's right," Daniel said. "That's exactly right." Owen looked up from the bench. Something in his face shifted. The specific expression of someone who has been doing something because they believed in it and has just had that belief confirmed by someone whose opinion actually matters to them. It was a look Daniel recognized. He'd seen a version of it in himself once, years before, when his father had watched him do something careful and precise with a piece of timber and had nodded without saying anything. The nod that was worth more than words. He went back to the bathroom. Owen went back to the architrave. The afternoon proceeded with the particular quality of work done well by people who understand what they are doing and why it matters. By month 4, he had a waiting list. By month 5, he rented a shed in Maylands, old, unpretentious, with enough space for a proper workshop, and began doing restoration work on architectural elements off-site. By month 6, he had registered as a business, Daniel Carrick Heritage Carpentry, and was operating above the table, with insurance and proper invoicing, and the incremental acquisition of the certifications his work actually required. By month 9, the phone call came. He was in the Maylands shed, working on a pair of original sash windows from a Claremont house, when Owen appeared in the doorway and said someone from the National Trust was on the line. Daniel put down the glass and went to take the call. The project was a 1890s merchant's house in Fremantle, one of the significant ones, a double-fronted brick house with ornate pressed metal ceilings and original jarrah throughout, part of a historic streetscape that the National Trust wanted properly restored ahead of a heritage designation. There was government grant funding. There was a formal project brief. There was a budget that represented more money than Daniel had seen in a single line item since he'd been a corporate project manager. "We've been asking around," the Trust's project officer said. "Your name keeps coming up. People say you understand how these buildings were made." "I do," he said. "The previous contractor pulled out 3 weeks ago. We're 6 months from the grant deadline." "I can meet that deadline," he said, and meant it. He stood in the Fremantle street outside that merchant's house for a long time before the first walk-through. The building had the quality of something that had survived more than it should have. The original lime render still intact beneath later coatings, the original windows still in their frames, though badly in need of work. The kind of bones that show a builder who understood what Perth's weather would ask of a structure over a century and built accordingly. It was the most significant project he'd been offered, and he felt the weight of that as a good weight, a weight that meant something. He called Owen and Rhea. They started the following Monday. While Daniel was building, Rachel's world was conducting its own trajectory, and that trajectory bent steadily, inexorably, toward the ground. The conservatorship she'd fought for had come with legal obligations she'd perhaps not considered carefully enough when she'd been focused on securing it. As court-appointed trustee of Emma's estate, Rachel was required to file accounts, to document every transaction, to demonstrate that the money she was managing was being properly managed. This is the routine machinery of estate law, designed to protect exactly the sort of person Emma's estate was supposed to be protected for, and it operated without emotion, without mercy, and without the ability to be charmed or manipulated. The first audit flagged a discrepancy. The estate had been $340. It drew zero when Rachel took control, plus accrued interest. The current balance was $190,000. $150,000 had moved somewhere in transactions that bore authorization signatures that the court's handwriting analyst found, upon examination, inconsistent with Emma's known signature. Forged documents. That was the finding. Someone had created authorization paperwork, signed Emma's name, and used those documents to transfer funds from the estate to accounts that proved, upon further investigation, to be Rachel's mortgage lender, Rachel's car finance company, and a timeshare property in Bali. Rachel's lawyer found out before the formal finding. He withdrew from her case with a speed and finality that made his position regarding her guilt entirely clear without a single word being said on the subject. The court-appointed auditor's report landed with the weight of a thing that cannot be taken back. The legal letters began arriving from the estate court, from the prosecution service, from the regulatory body overseeing legal practitioners for the process violations of attorneys who'd assisted without fully understanding what they were assisting. Rachel's husband, Marcus, found out on a Thursday when a courier delivered documents to their Dalkeith house while Rachel was out. He was still there when she came home. The conversation that followed ended the marriage. He was gone before the week was out, back to his parents in Scarborough, and the rose garden in front of the Dalkeith house continued to grow without anyone to tend it. Daniel heard about it through the network that had developed around him over the months of his rebuilding. Judith, who heard from her friend who sat on the Heritage Society committee with a woman who lived 2 streets from Rachel in Dalkeith and had noticed the second car disappear from the driveway. News in Perth's inner suburbs travels the way news always has in places where people know each other, through the careful, accurate, irresistible channel of people who have context and do not hesitate to share it. He heard the information in 2 stages, which was how news of this nature traveled. First, the partial version, something had gone wrong with the estate. Then, a week later, when someone else had put more pieces together, the full picture. The forged documents, the transferred funds, the audit, the criminal charges pending. He received this at the Maylands shed, standing by the bench with a cup of tea going cold in his hand, listening to Judith's careful recounting with the attention of someone hearing about events that concern them deeply but at a remove. He did not feel what he'd assumed he would feel. There had been nights in the studio apartment when he'd imagined something like this. Not specifically, not with the clarity of someone who knew what Rachel had actually done, but in the general way that aggrieved people sometimes imagine justice in the dark, the sense of a reckoning, of the scales tipping, of the damage being seen and named. He'd thought that if justice came, it would feel like something, relief perhaps, or satisfaction, the clean feeling of a problem resolved. Instead, he felt the complicated weight of it. Rachel had a life, a husband, a house with roses out front, a social world in Dalkeith that Emma had been part of. Whatever Rachel had done, the unravelling of it was not clean. It was messy in the way that human situations are always messy, consequences distributing themselves across people who were guilty in varying degrees and innocent in varying degrees. The world slightly worse and slightly better at the same time because of what had happened. He thought about Emma, about what she would have felt hearing this about her sister. Emma had loved Rachel, had navigated the complexity of their relationship with a generosity that Daniel had sometimes found difficult to share, but had always admired. Emma had known, he thought, that Rachel was not easy to love. She'd loved her anyway, the way you love people who are complicated by proximity, by shared childhood, shared parents, shared history that is too deep to excavate and too present to ignore. He felt many things when he heard. He sat with them. He did not feel the satisfaction he thought he might have expected. He felt something closer to the exhausted recognition of a pattern completing itself, the understanding that Rachel's actions had always contained their own ending, that the elaborate structure she'd built on contempt and fraud would eventually bear the weight of its own foundation and collapse. He kept working. The Fremantle house was 2/3 done. The pressed metal ceilings were being carefully cleaned and restored, the original pattern emerging from beneath decades of paint. Owen had developed a touch with the lime render that Daniel found genuinely impressive. Ria had sourced matching period hardware from a demolition salvage yard in Welshpool that she'd spent 3 Saturdays methodically working through. The letter from the estate court arrived in month 11, Formal, precise, legal language dense, but readable in its essentials. Rachel had been removed as trustee. Her fraud was documented and would proceed to criminal prosecution. The remaining estate assets, $190 dollars in the account plus additional recovered value from assets purchased with fraudulent transfers, would be distributed to the legal beneficiary of Emma's estate, Daniel Carrick, sole heir by virtue of their marriage, Emma's will, and the simple and irrefutable fact that he was her husband and she had loved him. He sat in the Malin's workshop with the smell of timber and linseed oil around him and read the letter 3 times, not with triumph, with something more complicated than that. The money had never been about the money exactly. Emma's father had worked a lifetime for it, and Emma had received it as the thing it was, not wealth, but a kind of love made tangible, a man saying to his daughter, "This is what I spent my life building, and I want it to be yours." That was what had been taken, and that was what was being returned. He put the letter in his shirt pocket and went back to work. The mediation happened on a Tuesday morning in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building on St. George Terrace, the kind of room that is designed to be neutral and achieves this by being slightly uncomfortable in every direction. The chairs too formal, the air conditioning too cold, the view of the city below somehow emphasizing the distance between what happens in rooms like this and the actual life of the city it overlooks. Daniel arrived with the estate lawyer Judith had recommended, a woman named Freya, who had the calm precision of someone who has made peace with complexity and finds it straightforward. He wore clean clothes, had gotten a haircut for the first time in months, and felt the particular steadiness of a man who no longer had anything to lose and therefore cannot be threatened with loss. Rachel was already there when he arrived. Across the table, with a court-appointed representative, her own lawyers had by this point largely extricated themselves. He had not seen her since the kitchen in Dalkeith, where Gordon had laid out his folder and the ambush had begun. She looked terrible. Not the contained, polished Rachel of Christmas dinners and legal meetings. This Rachel was grey-faced and thin, her clothes hanging loose on her frame in the way that happens when weight leaves a person rapidly, in response to something that cannot be managed by eating. The stress had done what stress does over sufficient time. It had carved into her face, aged her. She looked, he thought, like a person who had not slept well in a very long time. He felt nothing approaching triumph at the sight of her. He felt something he hadn't expected to feel and hadn't been prepared for. He felt pity. Not forgiveness, not at that moment, not in that room, but pity. The recognition of a human being who has made choices that have eaten them alive and who is now sitting in the wreckage of those choices. The mediator walked through the terms methodically. Rachel would repay what she could, according to a schedule determined by her available assets. Criminal fraud charges would proceed separately through the appropriate channels. She would face probation, possibly a custodial sentence. The estate would pass permanently out of her authority and into Daniel's. And then Rachel spoke. The mediator had finished. The papers were on the table. All that remained was the signing. The room had the quality of something that is almost over. The particular silence before a final page is turned. Rachel looked at Daniel. She had been looking at her hands most of the morning, but now she looked at him, and there was something in her eyes that was not remorse, not fear, not even the anger of a person being held accountable. It was something older, something that had been sitting beneath every family gathering, every politely managed Christmas, every handshake and embrace and "How are you?" and "Fine, thank you," sitting there all along and waiting for this room, this moment. "You didn't deserve her," she said. Her voice was flat, like something from which all effect had been wrung. "You were always so ordinary. Emma could have had anyone. She settled for you, and I had to watch it for 15 years. Watch her waste herself on someone so mediocre." The room was silent. You know what's remarkable about that moment? Not the cruelty of it, though it was cruel. What was remarkable was its clarity. In one sentence, Rachel had answered every question about the preceding 14 months. Not concern for Emma's memory, not grief expressed sideways. This had always been this. A woman who had watched her sister love someone she considered unworthy and had never in 15 years been able to forgive either of them for it. Daniel sat with the words for a moment, felt them land, felt the room watching him to see what he would do with them. He looked at Rachel, really looked at her across the table in the flat fluorescent light of that conference room. This woman who had orchestrated the destruction of everything he'd had and was now offering him the pure, distilled version of why she'd done it. And he felt the pity again, cleaner this time, simpler. "I loved her," he said quietly. The room was still. That was never a settling, not for either of us. He turned to Freya, his lawyer. "Shall we sign?" Oui, he signed the papers and walked out of the conference room and took the elevator down 14 floors and stepped into the Tuesday morning on St. George Terrace, where Perth was going about its ordinary business. And he stood on the footpath for a moment, breathing the air, which smelled faintly of coffee from a cart on the corner and the particular mineral clarity of a city near the coast. He thought about Rachel's words, about the 15 years she had spent sitting across from him at family dinners, watching him hold Emma's hand, watching Emma laugh at something he'd said, watching them navigate the ordinary and extraordinary of a shared life, and feeling this contempt, this certainty that he was insufficient, this conviction that Emma had made a mistake in choosing him. He thought about the version of himself those words were describing, ordinary, mediocre, not enough. He thought about the ceiling rose in Judith's cottage, the 11 hours, the way it had looked when he stepped back, the way Judith had said quietly, "My aunt used to talk about that rose." He thought about Owen, who had come to him knowing almost nothing and could now read a building the way a musician reads sheet music. Understanding structure, intention, the relationship between decisions made 100 years ago and the problems presenting themselves today. He thought about Ria, who had spent 3 Saturdays in a salvage yard in Welshpool finding period-accurate hardware because it mattered to get it right. He thought about the merchant's house in Fremantle, that 1890s building that had survived more than it should have. That was going to survive more still, because hands that understood it had cared for it properly. Ordinary, mediocre. Maybe to Rachel's eye, measuring by the metrics Rachel used to measure people. But Rachel's metrics were not ones he recognized anymore. They had never, perhaps, been the right ones. He walked to the bus stop and went back to the workshop. The Fremantle merchant's house was completed 17 days later. Daniel stood in the front room on the final morning, while the National Trust's photographer moved through the spaces with her camera and looked at what 6 months of work had made. Every room period accurate, every material chosen for correctness as well as durability, every detail honored. The pressed metal ceilings cleaned and restored to the depth of their original pattern. The Jara floors sanded back and finished with a preparation whose formula he'd researched in historical records at the Batty Library on 3 separate Saturdays. The sash windows running smoothly in their frames for the first time in decades. The Trust's project officer walked through with him that morning, making notes, asking questions, nodding at things she found well executed. At the end, she shook his hand. "There's going to be a plaque," she said. "We do that for significant restorations, the building's name and date and the restorer. Is Daniel Carrick Heritage Carpentry correct?" He said it was. He stayed after everyone left, alone in the building, as the afternoon light moved across the Jara floors and the restored ceiling rose cast its shadows in the way the craftsman who'd made it in 1894 had intended. He sat on the stairs and thought about his father's workshop at the back of the Cannington house, the smell of sawdust and the sound of planes. His father's hands on timber, the way his own hands were learning to be on timber, with understanding, with respect, with the attention that the material demanded. His father would have liked this house, would have walked through it and known what had been done here, would have been proud, Daniel thought, and felt the warmth of that thought move through him without the grief that usually accompanied thoughts of his parents. Just warmth, just the sense of a line connecting things across time. The business had a name and a reputation and projects booked 9 months into the future. He employed 5 people now, Owen and Ria and 3 others who'd found their way to him through the grapevine that ran through Perth's heritage building community. He had the workshop in Maylands and the proper certifications and the insurance and all the formal apparatus of a legitimate business. And it had come from a notice on a corkboard in a cafe because he'd walked in with old drawings under his arm on a day when he had nothing else to do. The studio in Northbridge was years gone, in the way that certain places become fully historical, not just past, but unimaginable from the present. He'd bought a workers' cottage in Inglewood, 1935 construction, cream brick with a terracotta tile roof and a back garden that had been let go for years and was slowly becoming something under his attention. He was restoring the cottage himself in the hours outside of work, slowly, with the pleasure of something done without deadline, uncovering original details and deciding what to honor and what to quietly improve. It was home. Not the Cottesloe apartment, which had been beautiful and full of Emma, and which he would always think of with a grief that had softened into something closer to tenderness. The Inglewood cottage was different. It was his, made by his hands, becoming what he was becoming rather than what he had been. There was Emma in it too, not literally, not in the obvious ways, but she was in the care he brought to old things, in the conviction that what is worth preserving is worth preserving properly. She had looked at her father's money and said, "It's his life," meaning she understood that things carry the life of those who made them. He understood that now in his hands, the way she'd understood it in her mind. He still had the urn. It was in the bedroom, on the windowsill where the afternoon light hit it. He'd found a way to think about it that was neither denial nor surrender. Emma was gone, and Emma was also somehow continuous in the ways that the people we love most become continuous, woven into how we see things and what we value, and the choices we make on days that feel like nothing in particular, but are secretly everything. He had started to sleep through the night. It had happened gradually, so gradually he hadn't noticed until one morning he realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd been awake at 3 a.m. His hands had something to do with this, he thought, the good tiredness of physical work. And something else, the absence of the circling, which required emptiness to sustain itself, and his days were no longer empty. One of his clients was a librarian named Sophie. He'd been hired to restore her grandmother's house in North Perth, a 1918 bungalow, deeply loved, full of the kind of specific detail that accumulates over generations of occupation by the same family. Sophie had grown up in that house for parts of her childhood, visiting her grandmother every school holiday, and she knew it the way you know a place that has been a constant in your life. Its specific sounds, the way the light moved through the kitchen in the afternoon, the smell of the back garden in different seasons. She came by during the project regularly, partly to check on progress and partly, he eventually understood, because she wanted to be there. She'd make tea in the original kitchen while he worked in adjacent rooms, and they'd find themselves talking about the house, then about other things, then about whatever things two people talk about when they're figuring out whether they want to keep talking. She was sharp and funny and unsentimentally kind, and thought carefully before she said things, which he found increasingly rare and valuable. She asked him once about Emma, directly, with the courtesy of someone who wasn't asking out of curiosity, but out of genuine interest in him. And he told her the truth, which was that Emma had been the best of everything he'd known before, and that he would love her always in the way you love someone you shared your real life with, and that this didn't feel like a closed door to him anymore. Sophie had listened to all of that without flinching and said, "That's a healthy way to hold it." He'd laughed, surprised. "You think so?" "I'm a librarian," she said. "I've read a lot about grief. Yours sounds like you've actually done the work." The coffee after project meetings became coffee not about the project. There were 2 months of that coffee phase, which is not a short time if you are paying attention to it. He was paying attention. After the years of not looking, of building a professional identity that had consumed the space where an interior life was supposed to live, he found he had become more observant of people, of what they said and didn't say, of the texture of conversations that were about something underneath what they were nominally about. Sophie talked about books in a way that other people talked about people, with the attention and care of someone who had spent years in genuine relationship with the thing she was describing. Not as product, not as status, but as actual company, as encounters that had mattered to her and continued to matter after they were over. She'd mention something she'd read and then pause, not to perform the memory, but to actually remember it, and the pause told him more about her than the words did. She asked questions, too, not the questions of someone filling conversational space, but questions that followed from things he'd said, that picked up threads he'd dropped without knowing he'd dropped them. She'd ask about something he'd described from a past project, 3 weeks after he'd mentioned it in passing, in a way that showed she'd been thinking about it. He found this unexpectedly moving, the evidence that someone was carrying what he'd said rather than waiting for her own next chance to speak. He told her about his father. He hadn't planned to. It came out in the context of a conversation about the tools he used, about where his understanding of old timber and traditional techniques had come from, and he found himself talking about the workshop at the back of the Cannington house, and the smell of sawdust and his father's hands, and the afternoons he'd spent watching, then helping, then being taught without knowing he was being taught. Sophie listened in the way she always listened, without rushing, and when he finished, she said, "He sounds like someone who understood that how you do something is what you're teaching, not what you're doing." He looked at her across the cafe table. It was one of those moments where someone says the exact right thing and you don't quite know how to respond because the rightness of it is large and you weren't braced for it. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly it." She looked at him steadily for a moment. "He'd be proud of what you're doing." He thought about Rachel in the conference room. Ordinary. Mediocre. He thought about his father's hands on the planes in the workshop. He thought about the Fremantle merchant's house and the ceiling rose in Judith's cottage and Owen at the bench in Bassendean, shaping old-growth Jarrah into something that would last. He thought about all of that, and about the woman across the table who had read him carefully enough to say the right thing. "I think he would be," Daniel said, and for the first time since the funeral, he meant it without qualification. The coffee became dinner a few times at a Lebanese place in Mount Hawthorne that they both discovered they already liked. Then dinner became the particular comfortable frequency of two people finding each other without having gone looking for it. One evening, she was in the kitchen of her grandmother's restored house. They were doing a final walkthrough, his last day on the project. And she turned to him in that kitchen where 4 generations of her family had made meals, surrounded by the specific light and smell and feeling that came from the space being properly honored rather than stripped and redone. And she kissed him. A simple kiss, and then she stepped back and looked at him. "Is this okay?" she said. "I know you were married. I know she passed. I don't want to—" "It's okay," he said, and he meant it with the complete and unambiguous conviction of a man who has done the work and arrived somewhere on the other side of it. He drove home through the evening city, Perth cooling toward autumn, the light going amber over the river, and his phone buzzed on the seat beside him. "Sophie, still on for tomorrow. I found something in the cottage attic I want to show you." He smiled, typed back, "Wouldn't miss it." She had a key to the Inglewood cottage now. She was there when he got home, in the kitchen, where he'd been slowly reinstalling the original cabinetry. And the sound of her moving around in there was a sound he had not known he was missing until it was present. The particular sound of another person inhabiting the same space as you with familiarity and ease. He stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the cottage that was becoming home, at Sophie in the kitchen, at the autumn evening through the window, the jacaranda he'd planted in the front garden, not yet flowering, the fence he'd rebuilt with proper materials, the lights he'd wired himself burning warm and steady against the dark. He thought about the text. Unknown number, 11:47 p.m., 14 months after he'd buried his wife, sitting outside a bottle shop with the engine running. "Your wife didn't die. She's alive and watching you." He thought about what it had cost, the job, the apartment, the money, the friendships, some of which had quietly returned, he found, once it became clear that the stories Rachel had told were not the whole story, some of which had not returned and whose absence had clarified their nature. The year and more of struggle, the mattress on the floor, the 1987 carpet, the bus rides through a city that had felt foreign. He thought about what it had given. Not given, that's not quite right. What it had forced. What the stripping away of everything comfortable had revealed was already there. The knowledge in his hands, the patience for difficult work, the ability to see what old things contained of the lives built around them. His father's son, it turned out. It had always been there, waiting under the project management role and the comfortable apartment and the careful career, the part of him that knew how to make something real. Rachel's last message had come from a prison email account, which had a header that identified it as such before you even opened the text. A single word, sorry. He'd read it. He'd sat with it for a moment, giving it the consideration any word deserves. He'd thought about what it meant, about the years behind it, about the ruin of Rachel's own life as much as the damage she'd done to his, about the particular tragedy of people who destroy others out of the interior corroding acid of their own contempt. He'd deleted it, not with anger, not with satisfaction, with the clean finality of a man who has looked at a thing and found that it no longer has any claim on him. Emma had said something to him early in their marriage, on a Sunday morning, when they were sitting on the balcony of the Cottesloe apartment drinking coffee and watching the ocean, that he'd carried without knowing it for years. She'd said, "The thing about you, Danny, is you're not performing anything. You're just exactly what you are. Most people find that hard. I've always found it a relief." He had not fully understood what she meant at the time. He understood it now. Ordinary, Rachel had called him. Mediocre. He'd heard those words in the mediation room and felt their intended weight and recognized that they were Rachel's assessment of a man she'd never actually seen, because what Rachel saw when she looked at him had never been him. It had been the projection of her own ideas about what Emma deserved, which was something larger, something more visible, something that would reflect better on the family's sense of itself. He had been exactly what he was. A man who had loved his wife fully and truly and without performance. A man who understood old buildings and could restore what was valuable in them. A man who taught what he knew and built things that lasted. A man who had fallen completely apart and had found, at the bottom of the falling, that there was something solid there to build from. Not ordinary, not mediocre, just Daniel. Which turned out to be enough. More than enough. He went inside. Sophie was making dinner, something with garlic and lemon that smelled like a specific kind of evening. the kind that has no drama in it and requires nothing except to be lived. He set his keys on the hook by the door, the hook he'd installed himself in the original wall with proper fixings that honored the brick, and washed his hands at the kitchen sink and stood beside her in the cottage that was becoming home. "What did you find in the attic?" he asked. She turned to look at him with the expression she had when she knew something good. The slight contained delight of a librarian holding a story she hasn't told yet. "Old letters," she said. "My grandmother's. I didn't know they existed. I want to read them with you." He thought, yes, this is the right next thing. Outside, Perth was settling into the evening. The jacaranda waited in the front garden. The river moved in its old channel toward the coast. Somewhere in Fremantle, a merchant's house built in 1890 stood properly restored, its pressed metal ceilings and jarrah floors carrying the weight of everything they'd been made to carry, and a small bronze plaque on the wall near the front door read, "Restoration by Daniel Carrick, Heritage Carpentry." He had lost everything and built something better from what remained. He had been stripped down to nothing and found, at the bottom of nothing, his father's hands. He had buried his wife and grieved her truly and carried her forward into a life she would have recognized as worthy of him. He was 44 years old, and he knew precisely and without doubt who he was. Here's what I want you to sit with after this story. There is research in psychology that distinguishes between two responses to catastrophic loss, what researchers call post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic growth. We hear a great deal about the first, the ways that devastating loss can break a person, leave them diminished and stuck and unable to move through their own history. We hear much less about the second, which is equally documented and perhaps more interesting. The evidence that some people, after the worst has happened, emerge not merely recovered, but genuinely transformed in the direction of greater authenticity, stronger relationships, and a clearer sense of what actually matters. The research suggests that what determines which path a person takes is less about the severity of the loss and more about whether they allow the experience to strip away what wasn't genuinely theirs to begin with. The comfortable job that was never quite right, the identity built on external markers rather than internal truth, the life shaped by what seemed appropriate rather than what was real. Daniel's collapse was engineered by someone else's cruelty, but his rebuilding was entirely his own. And what he built was not a replica of what had been lost. It was something newer and more honest, work that came from actual skill and genuine care. Relationships built on clarity rather than convention, a life that fit the shape of who he actually was. That text message, 5 words from an unknown number in the dark of a car outside a bottle shop, was designed to destroy him. Instead, it detonated the life he'd been sleepwalking through and forced him to find what was real underneath. This is not an argument for cruelty as a gift. It is an argument for the resilience that most people carry without knowing, the knowledge and the capability that sits waiting beneath the accumulated weight of what we think we're supposed to be. Some people spend their whole lives terrified of losing everything. Daniel Carrick lost it all and discovered something they never learn. You can survive it, more than survive. You can become, in the aftermath of total loss, the person you were always supposed to be. If this story moved you in any way, if it made you feel something real, that feeling is the whole point. Stories like this exist because human beings need to know that the worst does not have to be the end. Hit like if you want more stories like this, the ones that go all the way down before they come back up. Leave a comment. I want to know where you're watching from, and whether you've ever lived through something you thought would finish you and found out it didn't. Subscribe if you haven't, so you don't miss what's coming next. And speaking of what's coming next, the video sitting on your screen right now is a story I genuinely cannot wait for you to hear. A woman discovers that the person she trusted most in her life had been living a secret that erased 20 years of what she thought she knew. What she did next, and what it cost, and what it gave her, is one of the most quietly extraordinary things I've ever come across. Click it. It'll still be there in 5 minutes, but I don't think you'll wait that long. I'll see you there.